Now, this is a self-selecting crowd. I know some of you already know who Frances Perkins is, but a lot of people don't. So let's start by asking this question. How many of you know who Frances Perkins is? Oh, yes, this is great. Good, good, good. How about this? How many of you know someone on Social Security? Please raise your hand. How many of you know someone who is receiving unemployment insurance or who has ever received unemployment compensation? Okay. Frances Perkins' work. How many of you know someone who's working a 40-hour week, generally, more or less? Frances Perkins' work. How many of you know a 12-year-old who's quit going to school so that she can work full-time in a factory? Frances Perkins' work. Her ban on child labor, enacted in the Fair Labor Standards Act, made it possible to keep kids in school longer instead of in mills and factories. Let me start by telling you a little bit. It's awfully noisy here, but let me start by telling you a little bit. I want to read a little bit of the prologue from my book so that you know a little bit more about the breadth of Frances Perkins' accomplishments. On a chilly February night in 1933, a middle-aged woman waited expectantly to meet with her employer at his residence on East 65th Street in New York City. She clutched a scrap of paper with hastily written notes. Finally ushered into his study, the woman brushed aside her nervousness and spoke confidently. They bantered casually for a while, as was their style. Then she turned serious, her dark, luminous eyes holding his gaze. He wanted her to take an assignment, but she had decided she wouldn't accept it unless he allowed her to do it her own way. She held up the piece of paper in her hand, and he motioned for her to continue. She ticked off the items: a 40-hour work week, a minimum wage, workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, a federal law banning child labor, direct federal aid for unemployment relief, Social Security, a revitalized public employment service, and health insurance. She watched his eyes to make sure he was paying attention and understood the implications of each demand. She braced for his response, knowing that he often chose political expediency over idealism and was capable of callousness, even cruelty. The scope of her list was breathtaking. She was proposing a fundamental and radical restructuring of American society with enactment of historic social welfare and labor laws. To succeed, she would have to overcome opposition from courts, business, labor unions, conservatives. Nothing like this has ever been done before in the United States, she said. You know that, don't you? The man sat across from her in his wheelchair amid the clutter of boxes and rumpled rugs. Soon he would head to Washington, D.C. to be sworn in as the 32nd President of the United States. He would inherit the worst economic crisis in the nation's history. An era of rampant speculation had come to an end. The stock market had collapsed, rendering investments valueless. Banks were shutting down, stripping people of their lifetime savings. About a third of workers were unemployed, wages were falling, hundreds of thousands were homeless. Real estate prices had plummeted, and millions of homeowners faced foreclosure. His choice of labor secretary would be one of his most important early decisions. His nominee must understand economic and employment issues, but be equally effective as a coalition builder. He was a handsome man with aquiline features, and he studied the plain, matronly woman sitting before him. No one was more qualified for the job. She knew as much about labor law and administration as anyone in the country. He'd known her for more than 20 years, the last 4 in Albany, where she had worked by his side. He trusted her, and he knew she would never betray him. None of the items I just mentioned were part of the FDR's campaign platform in 1932. Nevertheless, he told Frances Perkins he would back her, and she agreed to accept the job. That night in bed, she actually cried in deep wailing sobs because she knew it was going to be such a difficult job. She would open herself to constant media scrutiny, harsh judgment, and public criticism. Yet she knew she must accept the offer. As her grandmother had told her, whenever a door opened to you, you had no choice but to walk through it. Frances Perkins would become the nation's first female Secretary of Labor. Now, we know what happened after that. The Social Security Act, passed in 1935, gave us unemployment insurance, Social Security, and our welfare system known as aid to dependent children, designed to help the children of parents, of mothers left to raise their children alone. The Fair Labor Standards Act, passed in 1938, set that 40-hour work week. It set them a minimum wage. It put the ban on child labor. Other things she did: FHA insurance. She was the primary booster of the Civilian Conservation Corps. She was the largest single supporter of the WPA. Truly, this was a really remarkable woman. Now, it's a little interesting and unusual that I came to write this book. I came from a staunchly Republican family. I actually came from a family of Roosevelt haters. But when I came to Washington, D.C. in 1988 as a young business reporter, one of the first things I did as I set out to learn my way around the town was to sign up for a trolley bus tour of the city. And one of the first things I noticed was the Frances Perkins Department of Labor. As those of you who live in Washington know, there's very few buildings in Washington named after women. And so I noticed it, and I filed it away and wondered, who was Frances Perkins? I'd never even heard of her. As we went around in the trolley bus on this day I took the tour, we got around over by the Washington Monument, and the tour bus driver said, in his, along with his regular patter, what American woman had the worst childbirth experience? There's a long pause. Frances Perkins. She spent 12 years in labor. That's the first time I ever remember hearing Frances Perkins' name spoken aloud. Now, I laughed, like the rest of you did, but it also, as a feminist, kind of irritated me, and ever after that, I kept Frances Perkins' name in my mind, and I kept listening for her. I spent 20 years at the Washington Post, and over the years, I realized how often I heard her name, often like a sort of a distant whisper. When we talked about Social Security, Frances Perkins. When we talked about age discrimination, Frances Perkins. When we talked about the Fair Labor Standards Act and making revisions to it, we talked about Frances Perkins. When we talked about the labor movement, we're talking about Frances Perkins. This was all her handiwork. Quite an extraordinary record of achievement. I spent 20 years then at the Washington Post. I went all over the country for the Washington Post. It was a wonderful life education, going to visit places and learn new things. And as I traveled around the country writing business stories, I began to realize how little I knew about the history of the working people of America. It's something that really isn't taught. In the late 1990s, I wrote a series of articles on sexual harassment. And I heard a lot of chilling stories about places where there'd been an imbalance of power, where people were able to use their power to force people to do things they didn't want to do. There were people who were sort of trapped in a cycle of abuse, and a lot of times the stories were really very bad stories. It's really much more akin to criminal activity than most of us have realized. And I heard all these stories all around the country, and I began to suffer myself what psychologists call secondary stress. And I got afraid to fly. I started to feel like authority figures couldn't be counted on to do the right thing if there were a problem. I suppose part of the issue for me was that I had both the good luck and the bad luck to sit by the Post's fabulous aviation reporter, Don Phillips. And he was writing about every plane crash that happened in America. So every day, and I was afraid to fly, I was overhearing him talk about every air accident that happened and just how the people on board had died. So I started to travel places by train whenever I could get away with it.